Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking about math for triangles specifically. This is where things start to get a little bit tricky because you start to get into these more complicated trigonometry, and I have found that this is where everybody's brain just kind of shuts down. Things are not in whole numbers anymore. You've got to do like more advanced math that you probably haven't touched since high school, and all of us, designers included, just kind of go, I don't really want to deal with that. Right? Like, give me, cut to the chase. Give me some simple rounding things that I can use to try and get there. A lot of times we're trying to trim, and it just gets very, very tricky. So I'm going to talk through 3 specific cases and the basic math that underlines all of them. But if all of this is still a little too overwhelming for you, go ahead and check out my Mathless Quilts tool. This thing has all of the triangle math already integrated with it, and there are both free shape calculators and then paid advanced pattern calculations that will do all of your pattern math for you, including all the math for triangles, and it makes it really easy. You never have to touch an equation. But this is kind of the underlying math that is baked into that software. So first of all, let's talk about triangles sewn on the diagonal. This is kind of a misnomer calling them that way, but basically this is a piece where you are cutting a free triangle and then you're sewing it into the rest of your quilt, as opposed to sewing half square triangles or something like that, where the shape is made together with a separate fabric all in one go, and you never have to deal with kind of these free triangles where the math starts to get wonky. So why is this tricky? Well, the reason is because we need a 1/4 inch of seam allowance on the entire perimeter, including on that diagonal edge. And what that means is that while it's a 1/4 inch right here, which is all well and fine, it's no longer a 1/4 inch here on the 45-degree corner of that triangle. In fact, when we sew these together, what you'll actually see up here is that we've got this overhang that is not a 1/4 inch, it's something else that's determined by trigonometry. We don't want to get into that, but there are some simple kind of rounding things that we can use here, but this is why it's tricky, right? It's not as simple as just saying, I need my triangle to be 10 inches wide because that's my block size, and I just cut a square at 10 inches and then I cut it on the diagonal and everything's good. We have to add a little extra to it because we are going to basically not be able to use any of this kind of 45-degree corner that's hanging off once it's all sewn in, because at the end of the day, this is your final piece and none of this counts for anything when it's all said and done. So how do you deal with this? What is the underlying math? Basically, you want to just add an inch to whatever your finished length dimension is, right? So if we need to match a 12-inch block here, I'm going to cut this thing at 13 inches, cut it along the diagonal, and that will give me a triangle that finishes just slightly over 12 inches. It's going to give us some trimming room here. The real math is closer to 7/8, but it's not quite that either because this is trigonometry and it doesn't work in fractions that are 1/4 of an eighth, unfortunately. But if you basically add a 1/2 inch to whatever you think it should be, right? So if you think it should be 12.5 inches unfinished, add another 1/2 inch to that. That gets us to that 13 inches. It's the same thing as adding an inch to the finished size. That'll get you something that you can trim down and will be the correct size without being overkill. Let's talk about setting triangles next. Now, this was something that I didn't fully grasp as a modern quilter who was more or less self-taught until I started really getting into a lot of tech editing. Traditionally, for an on-point quilt design, you actually use what I will call 1/4 and 1/2 triangles in different places to try and avoid bias edges. So if we look at kind of the perimeter of our quilt, I don't really want bias edges there because when I'm loading this on my long arm, even if I sew a victory lap, as I'm trying to get this massive thing onto the frame and get it quilted, get it basted, all of those things, those bias edges can stretch, and that's not ideal because then you'll end up with, you know, the edge of your quilt doing the wave, which is not great. So traditionally, the way that they would combat this is actually putting a 1/4 triangle on the side pieces and then putting a 1/2 triangle on the corner pieces. The reason for that is because it allows you to remove that bias edge, right? 1/2 triangle, your bias is going to be on this diagonal edge. That diagonal edge ends up getting sewn to your block, so it's not on the exterior of your quilt. Likewise, with a 1/4 triangle, the exact same thing's happening, right? Your bias edges are going to be these kind of 90-degree corner edges, and that diagonal edge is actually going to be straight of grain for you, and that is the edge that on these side triangles ends up on the outside of the quilt. So again, we're perfect. We don't have to deal with those bias edges. But that does mean that you do need 2 different size starting squares for your quilt if you're going to use setting triangles in this way. And again, because we've got trigonometry in the mix, the math for this is not easy. So I've got the equations down there on the bottom for each of these different kind of 1/4 and 1/2 triangles, but what I'm going to tell you is that Mathless Quilts takes care of this all for you. It's all baked in. You don't have to think about this. You're just going to put the dimensions that you need in there, which are generally your block sizes, and it's going to do the rest for you. So just do that. It's way easier, I promise. With both of these equations, you're going to get something that is not a perfect 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, anything like that. So what you're gonna do is just round up to the nearest one. If you're okay cutting 1/8, round to the nearest 1/8. If you don't want to deal with that, round up to the nearest 1/4, but then you might have a little extra that you really do need to trim or else it's gonna throw things off, which is generally totally fine when you're bringing a quilt together like this. Okay, the last kind of triangle math that I have for you is triangles by the strip. And I've talked a lot about this because this is actually my very favorite method for making 1/2 square triangles. You can do a 1/2 square triangle by the strip method. The math I'm going to show you is a little bit different than the math for that because you actually have seam allowances on both long edges, but this technique is really popular for making these kind of diagonal straight squares. There's all kinds of different interesting traditional blocks that you can make in this way, as well as just kind of cutting out a whole bunch of triangles if you need free triangles for like a birds in the air block or something like that very quickly without trying to get into too complicated of cutting instructions. So let's talk about the math for this. If I need kind of the straight edges of my triangle to be a certain size when I sew them into a block, and the unfinished dimensions of that is A, what I'm basically going to do is multiply that 0.707 and then add 1/4, right? That's that diagonal edge seam allowance that we're going to take out when we take 2 of these triangles and put them together like you see in that block in the top left corner. Again, the 0.707, that's a trigonomic function of the angles that we're working with here. I didn't put it there in terms of cosines and sines just because that's a pain in the butt to deal with, but this is the basic equation that you'll need to work with if you want to use kind of a strip triangle method. So there you have it. That's kind of 3 different flavors of right triangle math that you might encounter when you're trying to write a pattern. It seems a little bit difficult when you first get started with it, but these basic equations simplify it greatly, and the more you work with it, the easier it'll be. But again, go check out my Mapless Quilts calculator. It does have kind of free shape calculators that will deal with a lot of this for you. Alrighty, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next time for Tech Tip Tuesday.